Hello everyone, good morning. Welcome to my channel. So today I'm going to talk about one of the most important topic. So I was getting, many requests that I need to make in video for MuleSoft interview questions and answers. So here I am making a video for the MuleSoft interview questions and answers, right? So I am segregating it into two parts. So this video will be part one. So it will include most frequently asked questions for 2 to 4 years of experience candidate, and it will include basic concept architectures and its scenario-based problem solvings and optimization. So before we start, just I'll just talk about this. Connecting system is easy, but connecting them correctly is what gets you hired, right? So many interviewer evaluate you based on the architecture and your understanding about the integrations, right? So most MuleSoft interviews fail not because of the lack of coding, but lack of API-led strategy, right? So want to know exactly what hiring managers are looking for in 2026? So this video is for you. So I have compiled the top questions right from the basic concepts to architecture to real based scenario real time scenario based problems and it's solving and optimizations. So let's get started. And first, yeah, let's be honest, a MuleSoft interview can feel like a, we can say marathon through any pen platform, but whether you are a fresh muley or a seasoned pro, so the core principles remain same. And you need to focus on the new technology trends like ACB, MuleSoft Vibes, MCP. Okay, so I'm sharing the exact answers that impress technical evaluators in MuleSoft ecosystem. So the contents table of contents here, introduction first slide will be for the introduction, and I'll talk about what all aspects you need to include in the introduction, and it should be very short and concise, right? So and then architecture and API-led connectivity, then real world scenarios and challenges, and then Mule's Dataweave, which is the heart and language of the Mule 4, and then Mule 4 core and flow control, right? So first introduction. So you introduce yourself in short and mention educational and career background and you mention all these new technology trends like any point code builder, MUnit, and you can generate MUnit using new AI generated like MuleSoft vibes to increase the test coverage and MuleSoft AMCP support model context protocol. So you will stand out, from 99% of other candidates. So it shows you understand the new technology trends and how MuleSoft fits into the global AI trend. So let's start with architecture and API-led connectivity. So candidates at this level are expected to understand, okay, why they are building, not just how they are building, right? So an interviewer will evaluate your understanding why. So explain API-led connectivity and its layers. Say experience API, process API, and system API, right? So experience APIs are format data for a specific end user needs like mobile channel, web portal, partner APIs, and the process API is for orchestration and data aggregation across systems. And so all business logic will be included in process APIs, and the system APIs that connects to the core systems to get the data like Salesforce app, databases, and any legacy system to insulate that the consumer from complexity, right? And what is the difference between an API and Mule application? So an API is a contract, be it in RAML or open API specification that defines how to interact with the service. And Mule application is the actual implementation of that logic. And what is the role of API manager and runtime manager in a independent platform? So runtime manager handles deployment, scaling vCores, replicas, and monitors of the actual application. While API Manager handles governance and security policies, you can apply policies using API Manager and the complete lifecycle management. So you can just specify this answer. And then the questions are what is the difference between API-led and service-oriented architecture? So how does it API-led differ from traditional SOA? So key point would be while both focuses on the reusability, and SOA often leads to a monolithic ESB, enterprise service bus, where logic is centralized, right? And but API connectivity decentralize the logic into three distinct layers, which is experience, process, and system layers. So making it more agile and easier to scale. And what would be the API experience API strategy? Why can't we just consume process API directly from a mobile application? Why do we need experience layer? So your answer should be security and optimization. Because of the security and optimization, mobile apps might need a smaller JSON payload, not the entire payload, right? To save data, battery, and different security protocols compared to a web application. So the experience layer handles all these, format transformation without changing the core business logic in the process layer. So, and what is the use of designing? What is the designing for discovery? How do we ensure that our API are discoverable and reusable by other teams? Let's say I am designing an API, but the other team is also meant to use this API. So we can mention then using independent exchange where we are publishing our API. So we can just we can create design an API RAML contract or OS contract and publish documentation and provide mocking service to the users. And so that other teams can also build again against your API before you have even finished the implementation. So this is the beauty of the independent exchange, that is to discover and for the reuse. Yeah, independent exchange can be used. And API auto discovery. So what is API auto discovery and why it is critical? So when we add an instance in API manager, so it will create an API ID. So it links API auto discovery. It links the deployed Mule application to the API defined in the API manager. So let's assume that we have deployed an application in runtime manager, and the same contract we have created an instance in API manager. So it will link both deployed Mule application and the API contract. So without this link, the API manager cannot see the application to in order to apply security policies like rate limiting, client ID enforcement, and OAuth etc. And security policies, like which security policy would be applied at which layer. So you need to understand this. Like experience layer, a high level security like OAuth, OpenID Connect, client ID enforcement. We can we can enforce at experience layer, rate limiting, and system layer while IP whitelisting. So the only process API can invoke system API, and other basic authentication we can apply in system layer. Now this is the most important topic. So interviewers can evaluate you based on he can give you real world scenarios and then he wants to understand your approach. Okay, so I have drafted few real world scenarios and challenges, and it's concrete answer so that you can tell to the interviewer that okay, based on the usage, and then I'll explain. So handling legacy system, how do you design a system API for a legacy system, for a legacy database that can only handle 5 requests per second? So system A can only handle 5 requests per second, and we are creating a system API to connect to that legacy database. So the answer would be mentioned using the spike control or rate limiting policy in the API manager. We can achieve this. So we can also mention a queue mechanism. We can use the queue, anypoint MQ, SNS, AWS SNS, Rabbit MQ, or any other queue to buffer requests so that legacy system is not overwhelmed, right? And versioning strategy. When do we choose a minor version update or versus major version update for an API? So minor version update like adding a new optional field, so it can be backward compatible. But major if say deleting a field or adding a mandatory field, changing a data type, so it's a breaking change, right? So it will be a major release. So that's how we can maintain version strategy. So then real world scenarios again, the performance and the memory scenario. Okay, let's assume that our meal application is processing a large CSV file, let's say 1 gigabyte from an STP server, SFTP server. So after 5 minutes, the application crashes with the out of memory error, Java heap space. So how do you fix it? So your expected answer would be we can use streaming, ensure repeatable streams are configured correctly, and then for each versus batch job. So we cannot use a standard for each job, which leads to the whole collection stores into the memory. So instead we can use batch job, which splits the payload into into records and then process them in chunks, right? And we can optimize the database. We can ensure that in script is not using functions that force the entire payload into memory, like order by on a massive array, because it will hold all the entire payload into memory, so it will affect the performance. We code scaling. Check if the worker size is sufficient for the overhead, but prioritize code optimization first. Then we can look into the vCore scaling. Now the silent failure scenario. If let's suppose if you have a scatter gather component with three routes, and route A and B succeeded, but route C fails. So the flow doesn't stop, and the payload returned to the user is a mix of data and error object. Why did this happen, and how do you handle it? So the default behavior is scatter gather through a Mule composite routing error. So if any route fails, so the troubleshooting we can say if the flow continued. If the flow continued, it means a try scope with an on error continue was likely used inside the route C. So to ensure all or nothing, because if we need all routes to be successful or nothing, so we can use on error propagate. So inside the routes or handle the composite routing error in the main flow to roll back the transaction. So we can optimize this scatter gather accordingly. And the next option is topic is reliability and duplication scenario. So a system API is sending data to a legacy database, and sometimes the data is slow and causing a task timeout. So the client retries the request, resulting in duplicate records in the database. So how do you prevent it? So if you are asked about these questions, so we can tell idempotency, implement an idempotent message filter using an object store. So to track unique message ID, so that only it will be only it will insert it will send the unique data to the legacy database. And we can use until successful as well. Use the until successful scope, which is defined with retry policy to handle transient database slowness before the client even times out. And we can use transaction as well, wrap the DB operation in a local or exit transaction so that it will, if the flow is fails midway, so that the data is not committed and it's rolled back. And the next is the Cloudhub connectivity scenario. So the scenario would be like you deployed an application to Cloudhub and it works perfectly in your local independent studio. But in Cloudhub, it fails to connect to the on-prem Oracle database with the connection timeout. So what are the first thing you can check? So first thing you can say that, okay, I can check any point VPC VPN. Is the Cloudhub worker actually inside a VPC that has a VPN or direct connect tunnel to the on-prem network? So that needs to be checked. Then firewall. If on-prem has any firewall whitelisted the VPC IP range or the specific worker IP. And then we can check dedicated load balancer versus shared load balancer. So check if the connection is being blocked by a load balancer rule or if the DB port, example 808143 whatever, is open in the VPC security group or not. So these things we can check in order to troubleshoot this Cloudhub connectivity error. Then Dataweave data loss scenario. So the scenario would be you are mapping a complex JSON to XML, huge with a huge payload. So in the output, several fields are missing, but there are no errors in the logs. So what would be the likely cause? So we can say, okay, it might be a null handling because Dataweave's default behavior is to skip mapping. May skip mapping a field in the if the source value is null. I would use the default operator or check if for is empty using the is empty inbuilt function, and then selector issues verify if the input metadata has changed. If the JSON key changed from customer underscore ID to customer ID, means the selector payload dot customer ID will return null silently. We can use log points, add a log function inside the data view script so the to see the intermediate state of the data. So we can tweak these things to resolve this issue. And if you are asked about what would be the advantage of API-led connectivity and against without API-led connectivity, so we can say the change management is very easier. So changing a database require updating 10 apps, let's say, but in API-led connectivity, only the system API needs to be changed, right? And speed, every project starts from zero, but with API-led connectivity, 60 to 80% of API are already in exchange. So client can already use the mock service. And visibility, hard to see who is calling which API and what. So in here, I mean here, AnyPoint visualizer shows the full graph, who is calling what. Then the third topic would be Dataweave, which is the language of the Mule for to transform one format to another format. So in order to transform the canonical data model, we need Dataweave script. So what are the common functions you use? It can be asked. So be ready to explain map object, filter, flatten, reduce, lookup. So these are the commonly used functions. We need to just practice this, right? And how do you call a mule flow from Dataweave? This is also frequently asked question. So using the lookup function, we can invoke mule flow from Dataweave. And difference between single dollar and double. So single dollar represents the value, and the double dollar represents the key in objects or index in arrays. So you can practice Dataweave script on dataweave.mulesoft.com/learn/dataweave. So where you can provide the input and then you can write the script, and right hand side you can write in the right hand side you can see the output as well. Okay, and uh, so now the next is Mule for core concepts and the flow control. So what is the structure of Mule for event? So it consists of a message, which is a combination of payload plus attributes and variables. So unlike Mule 3, session variables no longer exist. Everything is a vars flow variable. Compare flow versus subflow versus private flow, right? So flow has a source wherever listener is there, means it is a flow, can have its own error handling and can be synchronous and asynchronous. And subflow, there is no source, process synchronously always and inherits the error handler of the parent flow. So subflow doesn't have its own error handler. Private flow is no source, usually called via flow reference, and but has its own error handler. And what is the difference between scatter gather and for each? So scatter gather executes routes in parallel. If one route fails, the whole component say unless wrapped in a try scope. What for each processes eliminates sequentially. Use parallel for each for concurrent processing of a collection. So this is the basic difference. Now the object store. Object store is the primary way to manage, state in a stateless environment like Cloudhub. So what is the difference between OS Object Store version 1 and version 2? So Object Store version 1 tied to a specific worker, and if the worker restarts, non-persistent data is lost. But in version 2, a separate service in the cloud, it allows sharing data across workers. Across workers, it shares the data in a multi-worker deployment and persists even if the application is restarted or redeployed, but the data is still persists. And what is the difference between persistent versus in-memory object store? So persistence is a written to disk and use this OAuth tokens or watermark. Use this for normally OAuth tokens or watermark and data that must survive a crash. That is the persistence. So it will survive a crash. But in-memory data stays in a Java virtual heap. It's a faster, but will be wiped if the application restarts. So you will lose the data if the application restarts or it deployed. And how do you handle expiration in object stores? So we can mention that TTL, entry time to leave, and expiration interval. So if you want to know more about TTL and expiration interval, you can watch my earlier video, so where I have explained with the example. And so the answer would be, scenario questions. If you set TTL to 30 days but don't configure expiration interval, so what happens? The answer would be the cleanup thread won't run because expiration interval is not configured. So that's why data may stay longer than intended. And what is the limitations of the object store? So object store is not a database. It doesn't support complex queries. So it will have only key values pair. So ACID transaction or high concurrency locking is not supported. We have HTTP request connector. So this is the most used connector in MuleSoft. You should know more than just about host and port. So response validators, the questions would be by default the HTTP request fails on a 404 not found. So how do you make it treat as 404 as a success? So you can configure the response rate validator to a success status code validator and include 200 to 499 means all 200 series and for 300 series and 400 series as a success validator code. And streaming in HTTP requests, we can explain repeatable streams in Mule 4. We can read a stream multiple times because Mule buffers it to a disk or memory automatically. And troubleshooting how we can, if you get a stream closed error, it usually means the streaming strategy is set to non-repeatable. Handling timeouts, if there is a connection timeout, time taken to establish the TCP handshake, and response timeout means time the request waits for the target system to process and send the payload back. And the target variable is the very important variable. So when we need to retain the original payload, and if we are calling any APIs or any flow, so we can use the target variable. So how do you call the enrichment API without losing the current payload? So use the target variable field in the advanced tab. It you can find it in advanced tab. The response of the API call will be saved to a variable. Whatever variable name we will mention there, and the original payload remains untouched. Now it's a batch job. Batch job is also one of the important topic you will be asked. And explain the internal phases of batch job in Mule 4. So we can explain the load and dispatch implicitly. Mule splits the payload into individual records and stores them in a persistent queue. And then process asynchronously. This is where the records are processed. Records are pulled from the queue in blocks, in chunks. The default is 100 and the processed by one or more batch steps. We can have multiple batch steps as well. And then on complete, which is an optional, provides summary report, for example, total records, failed records, time taken. And the payload here is a batch job result object. So payload will be inside the batch job results object. So where are the records stored during the batch job? So during a batch job, they are stored in a persistent queue on the disk. This is the key feature. If the application crashes or the server restarts, the batch job can resume from where it is, where it is ended, it left off. How we can handle error and reliability, or we can ensure the reliability in batch job. So by default, if a single record fails, the entire batch job halts, right? It stops pulling new records from the queue after the current block finishes. So this is controlled by the max failed records attributes. So currently the default is 0. We can configure according to our need. And how can you continue processing even if the same records fail? So we can set max record failed records to -1, means it will ignore all failures or a specific integer. We can say stop only after 10 failures or 5 failures, whatever benchmarks we have to specify. Now, how do you specifically handle failed records in subsequent steps? Right, so we can use the accept policy on a batch step, no failures, processes only successful records, and only failures means useful for a dead later step to log or handle errors. All means processes every records regardless of previous status. So, and how we can, improve the performance and optimized. So, what is the batch block size? Batch block size and why does it matter? It defines how many records are assigned. It defines how many records are assigned to a single thread at once. Current default is 100, and high block size, fewer input output operations, but it's faster but uses more memory. And low block size means more output operations but safer for very large payloads to avoid memory leak. And what is the batch aggregator used for? It is used to perform bulk operations. If we need to upsert 200 records to a Salesforce at once instead of one by one, so this drastically you reduce the number of API calls and network overhead. So follow up, you can use fixed size or streaming, process all records at once. So this is about all about batch job. Uh, uh, so I think, yeah, for the part one, I have covered introductions and Mule core features, Dataweave, and then architectural background, and then real world scenarios, problem solving scenarios. And so now the part two will have more interesting topics which will cover, if you go through the part one and then part two, I am damn sure that you will clear the interview if you are um, appearing for and up to 5 years of MuleSoft developer experience. You will definitely clear the interview. So the part two will contain the information about the questions and answers about security, which is the core topic, and the messaging, and then advanced data weave logic, and the reliability and transactions, how we can handle, and advanced error handling, how because interviewer will ask definitely the error handling scenarios, and then how we can improve the performance and the deployment of our API, and then what would be the logging best practices we have to follow while loading. Suppose we are pushing the log to the third party system like Splunk or Kibana. And then we have repo and branching strategy, how we can manage our repository and how branching strategy to push the code to the GitHub or Bitbucket or any other. And the CI/CD and DevOps concepts. So what would be the likely frequently asked questions related to CI/CD and DevOps, and the new technology trend like ACB, Anypoint Code Builder, You will know about MuleSoft Vibes, MuleSoft Dev Agent, formerly known as, and Mule's Model Context Protocol, which is the hot topic, and how you can transform your existing MuleSoft API into MCP tool so that it can be consumed by AI client or AI agent. So I'll come up with the part two very soon. So meanwhile, you just go through the part one of video, and definitely you'll be um, completely cracking those interviews if you are appearing for 2 to 4 years of experience. I'm damn sure you will get succeed. So hope you like it. Share with your friends and happy learning. Thank you. Bye.